It's one of those things, you think you've pretty much heard it all, and then, bam, something happens that just shakes you up.
Yeah, like a total curveball.
Right, and that's exactly how I felt when this whole situation went down in India on March 25th, 2025. It was like a seismic shift in the legal landscape, with the Supreme Court having to step in and, in a really big way, to address this, well, really unsettling ruling from the Allahabad High Court.
For me, it was the swiftness, the sheer speed of the Supreme Court's reaction that really hit me. It wasn't subtle at all, you know what I mean?
No, not at all.
It was like they were sending a huge signal, basically saying, whoa, hold up. This ruling from the lower court, it crosses a line. It really felt like a challenge to the fundamental ways we think about and respond to sexual violence, especially when it involves kids.
Absolutely. So, for everyone listening, what exactly are we talking about here? What was the big issue?
Well, it all started with this case that went before the Allahabad High Court. The case itself, it involved an alleged assault on a minor girl.
And we have to be a little careful here, right?
Absolutely.
Because, the full judgment, all the specific details, they haven't been made public yet.
Right, and understandably so.
To protect the child involved.
Of course.
But from what we've been able to gather, from legal circles, things circulating on social media, the accusation is that this accused individual grabbed the girl's breasts and then tried to pull off her pajamas, even going so far as to break the drawstring.
Yeah, that's what's been reported.
Now, here's where it gets really complicated. The Allahabad High Court, their conclusion was that while these actions, clearly criminal, they didn't actually reach the legal definition of what constitutes an attempt to rape according to the Indian Penal Code.
And you have to understand, the Allahabad High Court, it's a huge deal in the Indian judicial system.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly for Uttar Pradesh, which has this enormous population.
Right.
They handle a massive volume of cases, so how they interpret the law, it carries a lot of weight.
Makes sense.
So for them to come out and say that this didn't qualify as attempted rape, well, let's just say a lot of people had some serious concerns.
And I think concerns might even be putting it lightly. To really break down this initial ruling, we got to go to the source, right? Specifically to the Indian Penal Code and these two key sections, Section 376 and Section 511.
Okay, so 376, that's where they define rape and lay out all the punishments for it.
Right. 511, that deals with attempts to commit offenses, any offenses. Now, the Allahabad High Court, it seems, they went with a super strict interpretation of attempt to rape, a really narrow reading of the law. It almost felt like their logic was that because the actions, as alleged, didn't clearly show a path towards penetration, which is a crucial part of how rape is legally defined in India, they couldn't meet that bar for an attempted offense.
And I think this is where you start to see this real disconnect, right?
Absolutely.
Between a very literal, by-the-book reading of the law and what the victim actually goes through,
Yeah, that lived experience.
Exactly. It felt like the court was so focused on this one specific act, penetration, that they might have completely missed the forest for the trees,
Yeah.
The intent behind those actions, the incredibly violating nature of that assault, especially considering it's a child. That vulnerability is just immense.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why you saw such an immediate and powerful reaction from the public. I mean, social media, X specifically, just blew up. People were outraged. Words like appalling, unbelievable, they were everywhere. People were genuinely shocked at this kind of legal reasoning.
And you can't downplay the role of those legal news outlets like Bar and Bench, who got the news out there quickly. March 25th, it was like this wave of information and, frankly, dismay.
A tidal wave. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, right? The Supreme Court didn't wait around. They didn't wait for the usual appeals process to play out. They took something called suo motu cognizance. It's relatively rare, but it's a big deal because it means the court itself decided, hey, we need to look at this. They took initiative.
And that's a really strong signal, right? It basically shows that the Supreme Court itself recognized how serious this could be.
The implications of that lower court ruling.
Yeah.
And their response. Oh, man, it was swift and it was crystal clear. That same day, March 25th, a bench of the Supreme Court stepped in and issued a stay on the Allahabad High Court's observations. And they didn't mince words either. They explicitly said they were at pains to point out the total lack of sensitivity in certain parts of that lower court judgment. That's a pretty direct rebuke, from the
Right.
highest court in the land. It speaks volumes.
Absolutely. And that state, it's important to understand what it does. It essentially puts the brakes on that controversial legal interpretation.
Right. Yeah.
It signals that the Supreme Court has major concerns, and they're going to take a really hard look at this whole thing. But it is important to remember, as of today, March 26th, 2025, we're still waiting on the Supreme Court's final ruling.
Okay, so let's really get into the weeds here, the legal analysis. Where could the Allahabad High Court have gone wrong? To answer this, we have to bring in another really crucial piece of legislation. The Protection of Children from Sexual Offenses Act, better known as POCSO.
Right, and this is where things get really fascinating, because the Indian Penal Code, it deals with criminal offenses broadly.
Yeah, the big picture.
POCSO, it's laser-focused.
Ah,
It's specifically there to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation, so it offers this much more comprehensive, child-centered legal framework.
and this is where it gets really interesting, right? So POCSO has a much broader definition of what counts as a sexual offense against a child. Section 7, it defines sexual assault in a really inclusive way, explicitly saying that even touching a child's private parts with sexual intent is covered.
Right.
And then you have Section 18, which lays out the penalties for anyone who tries to commit those offenses.
And this is where a lot of legal experts are raising their eyebrows. The argument is that the Allahabad High Court might have messed up by relying so heavily on that narrow view of attempt to rape from the IPC,
Yeah.
maybe without really considering the specific, more expansive rules set out in POCSO. Because if you look at what's been reported about this case, right, the grabbing of the minor's breasts, the attempt to take off her clothes, it all points to sexual intent. It suggests actions moving towards a much more serious offense. And a lot of people are saying that would clearly fall under attempt, as it's defined by POCSO.
It really makes you think back to that comment from the Supreme Court about the lack of sensitivity. It really suggests that the Allahabad High Court maybe didn't look at the situation through the eyes of the child.
Yeah, the power dynamics in that situation, the whole reason these strong child protection laws exist in the first place.
Exactly. And when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the Supreme Court's intervention, it's not just about fixing a possible legal mistake in one case.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It's sending a much bigger message, almost a wake-up call for the whole judicial system. I mean, there's been this ongoing criticism, this concern that the Indian judiciary can sometimes lack sensitivity when it comes to cases of gender-based violence.
Oh, for sure. You hear it all the time, this worry about victim blaming, about sentences that don't seem to fit the crime, and a ruling like the one from the Allahabad High Court. It risks not only feeding into those negative perceptions, but, making people lose faith in the system's ability to really protect the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. So what are we left with? Well, the Supreme Court's actions, they address this one case, but they also set a crucial precedent. They emphasize that protecting victims, especially children, has to come before a super technical, overly narrow interpretation of the law, especially when we're talking about sexual violence.
Right, and it's important to remember that this case is still being reviewed.
Yes.
The Supreme Court might clarify things further, maybe strengthen those legal safeguards for children in these kinds of awful situations. We have to wait and see.
We do. But it's also really important to recognize how the public reacted to this, how quickly and how forcefully people condemned that initial ruling. That, combined with the Supreme Court's response, it shows that there's a growing expectation for our courts to be not just legally correct, but also aligned with, our modern values.
Totally. Equality, justice, empathy, especially when dealing with vulnerable people.
Absolutely. So if you take away one thing from this deep dive, it's this. The Supreme Court's intervention on March 25th, it wasn't just a small procedural thing.
Right.
It was a huge moment where the highest court in India felt they had to step in and stop a legal interpretation that many saw as, frankly, dangerous in the fight against sexual violence.
Totally agree. And while we're waiting for the Supreme Court's final word, the events of March 2025, they remind us how important it is to be vigilant, to hold our justice system accountable, and to make sure it upholds the true principles of justice.
I think that's a great place to leave it. But before we go, I want to leave you with something to ponder. We've seen how complex legal interpretation can be, especially in these cases where there's such a terrible violation, sexual violence against children. So the question is, how do we strike that balance? How do legal systems stay true to the letter of the law, but also stay committed to the spirit of justice, to protecting those who need it most? It's something we all need to think about.
Absolutely. A lot to unpack there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more.
See you then.
Bye for now.